Question 84 of the Summa Theologia has to do with epistemology, human epistemology, as we continue with this treatise on man, the treatise on human nature, and the official title of this question with 8 articles is How the Soul, While United to the Body, Understands Corporeal Things Beneath It. Now, we're going to have several questions in a row here about epistemology, and I got to say a couple of things about this. If I were to treat this question with what it deserves, this podcast would be an hour and a half long because there's so much here, but I try to keep these as brief as possible. It's still going to be kind of long, longer than the average podcast, but still, I'm just going to scratch the surface. But I also want to say that, in my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinions, epistemology is the topic that is probably the most important topic that we're going to be dealing with going forward. If you understand the whole issue of realism and nominalism and whether things that we can come to know are just names that we attach to it or if there's something real behind it, this is so fundamental, so important, and something that I'm increasingly believing is going to be what, if we don't get that down, if we don't understand it, if we don't teach it to the younger generation in the next 10, 15 years, I don't know if the culture can rebound. And so that's just a way of saying that this has to do with that. This is us coming to know things and what our faculties of our human nature are able to do and how it's done. And I think St. Thomas Aquinas explains it quite well because, we're a body-soul composite. So we have, as we've already learned, an intellect and a will. They are not attached or they don't function through a corporeal organ, and then we see things in the world, dogs and trees and cats and lizards and other people, which are physical but have forms. And so how do we come to know what those are? So that's what this is all about. Let me get to it. Article 1, whether the soul knows bodies through the intellect. Do we know bodies through the intellect? So this is very fundamental. He starts off giving a little bit of a history of philosophy and some of what the other philosophers through the ages have thought. He says it should be said in order to elucidate this question that the early philosophers, typically when he says early philosophers, he's talking about pre-Socratics or maybe Aristotle, Plato, but typically pre-Socratics, who inquired into the natures of things, thought that there was nothing in the world save bodies. Okay, everything was material to these people. And because they observed that all bodies are mobile and consider them to be ever in a state of flux, they were of the opinion that we can have no certain knowledge of true natures of things because everything's moving around. You can never pin it down, and so it's all individual things, right? Or what is in a continual state of flux cannot be grasped with any degree of certitude, for it passes away ere the mind can form a judgment thereon. That's why Heraclitus, the famous pre-Socratic, said you can never step into the same river twice. Why? Because it's always moving, right? After these came Plato, who, wishing to save the certitude of our knowledge of truth through the intellect, maintained that besides these things corporeal, the things moving around, there is another genus of being separate from matter in movement, which beings he called species or ideas. This is his realm of forms, the realm of ideas, by participation of which each one of these singular and sensible things is said to be either a man or a horse or the like. Wherefore, he said that sciences and definitions and whatever appertains to the act of the intellect are not referred to these sensible bodies, but to those immaterial and separate. So I don't know if you know the allegory of the cave and the Plato's idea of the realm of forms, but we'll go over it a lot more because Thomas refers to Plato in just about every one of these articles. So that according to this, the soul does not understand these corporeal things, but the separate species thereof. So Plato says we don't understand these things down here below, the corporeal things, We can only understand the realm of forms that which these physical things participate in. Now, this may be shown to be false for two reasons. So Thomas didn't have it. First, because since those species are immaterial and immovable, knowledge of movement and matter would be excluded from science. Okay, so science has a lot to do with things that are moving around. He's saying, well, wouldn't be able to do that. Secondly, because it seems ridiculous when we seek for knowledge of things which are to us manifest to introduce other beings, which cannot be the substance of those others, since they differ from them essentially. Now, this is almost Aquinas applying Occam's razor. Now, Occam came the century after Aquinas, but Occam's razor basically says don't add things, don't complicate things. So he's saying, well, we see these physical things. Why should we have this realm of forms that we can't see? Occam's razor would say you don't do that, right? And let's see. So he says, so also the intellect, according to its own mode, receives under conditions of immateriality and mobility the species of material and mobile things. So Thomas is already starting to say, yeah, there's got to be some relationship between our knowledge of material things and, what Plato has, but the material thing has to be taken into consideration, not just the immaterial. For the received is in the receiver according to the mode of the receiver. We must conclude, therefore, that through the intellect, the soul knows bodies by a knowledge which is immaterial, universal, and necessary. Universal, that is so very, very important, right? So that's Article 1. Article 2, whether the soul understands corporeal things through its essence. Now, I put a picture of a sandwich here because it's a corporeal thing. It's a sandwich. It's artificial. It's made by a human being, of course, with things that come from God, all the ingredients. So he's saying here, do we know things? Does the soul knows things through its essence? And I think you know that he is going to. Let me see if I can find. Okay, what he says here is that nothing but God knows through its essence, right? God is his essence. He is his existence, and so all things flow together with God. But with us and the angels, we don't understand through our essence, but through a power of our soul, which is our intellect and our will. He says, it is clear, therefore, from the foregoing, that if there be an intellect which knows all things by its essence, then its essence must needs have all things in itself immaterially. Thus, the early philosophers held that the essence of the soul, that it may know all things, must be actually composed of the principles of all material things. Now, this is proper to God, that his essence comprise all things immaterially as effects pre-exist virtually in their cause. God alone, therefore, understands all things through his essence, but neither the human soul nor the angels can do that. So God knows all things through his essence, just one act of being, but we participate in that being, in that the knowledge that God has. And this is really what is going to be so important in these other articles of this question, is our participation in what God already knows, and how our knowledge and our intellect and our will can participate in these. Article 3 says whether the soul understands all things through innate species. Now, by innate species, what he is going to get at is a teaching of Plato, that a person is born already having all the knowledge in them, but it's kind of back there. And so we have to go and kind of wake it up, so to speak, or kind of, it's, what did he say? Learning is remembering, right? So we have to see something and it's like, oh yeah, that's already in my mind. So innate means it's already there. It's not gained, it's already there. And Thomas is going to say, no, I don't think so. He said Plato held that naturally man's intellect is filled with all intelligible species, but that by being united to the body, it is hindered from the realization of its act. So Plato didn't have a good opinion of the human body. He thought it actually hindered the man's ability to kind of draw back in this all these innate ideas that are there from birth. But this seems to be unreasonable, first because the soul has a natural knowledge of all things. If the soul has a natural knowledge of all things, it seems impossible for the soul so far to forget the existence of such knowledge as not to know itself to be possessed thereof. For no man forgets what he knows naturally. So I think he's saying, how could you forget something if it's naturally in you? And especially unreasonable does it seem if we suppose that it is natural for to the soul to be united to the body as we have established above. This is a big part of Aquinas, is that the soul and the body belong together. So he's going to mention in several of these articles, well, what's the point? Why does the soul have to have a body? Plato thought it was just the ghost in the machine. The soul kind of lugged the body around. It was a hindrance to it coming to know things. Thomas had a much more positive view of the human body. For it is unreasonable that the natural operation of a thing be totally hindered by that which belongs to it naturally. Secondly, the falseness of this opinion is clearly proved from the fact that if a sense be wanting, the knowledge of what is apprehended through that sense is wanting also. For instance, a man who is born blind can have no knowledge of colors. So if it's still there, why is there this dependence on the senses, right? Because then you would know colors anyways, because if the body is useless, then why do you need the eyes, right? Article 4, whether the intelligible species are derived by the soul from certain separate forms. Okay, so a separate form would be, again, what Plato believes is it's separate from, so these cats here, the catness or the form of these cats, according to Plato, would be in a separate realm, kind of this eternal, immutable form of catness that these things just participate in. Thomas is not going to go that way. He said, some have held that the intelligible species of our intellect are derived from certain separate forms or substances, as I just explained. Plato held that the forms of sensible things subsist by themselves without matter. For instance, the form of a man, which he called per se man, and the form or idea of a horse, per se horse. So that just as corporeal matter, by participating the idea of a stone, becomes an individuating stone, so our intellect, by participating the idea of a stone, is made to understand the stone. All right, but it's separate. It's somewhere else. Okay, we just see what Plato would call shadows. These are just shadows of cats, but the real catness is somewhere else. Okay, now participation of an idea takes place by some image of the idea in the participator, just as a model is participated in a copy. So he held that the intelligible species of our intellect are images of the ideas derived therefrom, right? But since it is contrary to the nature of sensible things that their forms should subsist without matter, as Aristotle proves in many ways, right? So Aristotle is going to come along and say, no, there's a form of things, and there's something that unite these three cats. There is a catness, but it's inside. I mean, it's part of them. It's a composite. Each one of these cats has catness as part of its composite, and that's what we draw out when we come to know these things. And then, let's see, he says, but in this opinion, no sufficient reason can be assigned for the soul being united to the body, for it cannot be said that the intellectual soul is united to the body for the sake of the body, especially does the body seem necessary to the intellectual soul, for the latter's proper operation, which is to understand, since as to being the soul does not depend on the body. But if the soul, by its very nature, had an inborn aptitude for receiving intelligible species through the influence of only certain separate principles, as Plato said, and were not to receive them from the senses, it would not need the body in order to understand, wherefore to no purpose would it be united to a body. So Aquinas is saying, again, there's a reason why the soul is united to a body. The intellectual form and matter comes together. The soul needs the body, at least here below it's gonna need it. Article 5, whether the intellectual soul knows material things in the eternal types. Now this is where it gets really interesting. He says, Augustine, who was imbued with the doctrines of the Platonists, Augustine loved Plato, or at least the Neoplatonists, found in their teaching anything consistent with faith, he adopted it, and those things which he found contrary to faith, he amended. Now Plato held that the forms of things subsist of themselves apart from matter, as we've already explained a couple of times. And these he called ideas, by participation of which he said that our intellect knows all things. So that just as corporeal matter, by participating in the idea of a stone, becomes a stone, so our intellect, by participating in the same idea, has knowledge of a stone. Okay, so that's Plato. Therefore, now here's where Augustine's great contribution. So Plato had this realm of forms, immutable, eternal. It's off somewhere. It's, we don't quite know where it is, but it's just kind of out there somewhere. But all these shadow of things like plants and cats participate in this eternal form, but they're not the real thing. They're not the subject of our knowledge. These things are. Augustine, for the ideas defended by Plato, substituted the types of all creatures existing in the divine mind. So he took Plato's realm of forms and he puts it in the divine mind. Now it has a location. Now it makes more sense. It's not just out there, right? It's in God's mind. This is very important. According to which types all things are made in themselves and are known to the human soul. So now we see the relationship between where the reality, the truth of things, the form of things exists, and our being able to come to know them through our human nature, right? Article number 6 says whether intellectual knowledge is derived from sensible things. So do we receive intellectual knowledge from sensible things? And Thomas says, okay, he says on the part of the phantasms, intellectual knowledge is caused by the senses. Now, when you see this tree, since you have what's a phantasm, or the treeness of it is able to be drawn out of it, because through our eyes we see this green thing and it has a trunk in the bottom, and we are able to abstract the form out of it because we have knowledge of what it is. Okay, so even if I didn't show you that picture and I said tree, you can imagine a phantasm or imagination of a tree or a frog or a cricket or a dog or a sunset, right? You have all these in your mind because you've experienced them before. So that's the relationship between these physical things. But since the phantasms cannot of themselves affect the passive intellect and required to be made actually intelligible by the active intellect, it cannot be said that sensible knowledge is the total and perfect cause of intellectual knowledge, but rather that it is in a way the material cause. So the senses working together, with all the senses and the imagination and the memory, and remember all these faculties that we talked about, the active intellect, the passive intellect. Okay, that's one thing that is so not known, not understood by most people, is all the different workings of the human person and how they all contribute to us coming to know things. Article 7 is kind of long. Whether the intellect can actually understand through the intelligible species of which it is possessed without turning to the phantasms. And I'm going to go through this kind of quickly for the sake of time. In the present state of life in which the soul is united to a passible body, it is impossible for our intellect to understand anything actually except by turning to the phantasms. All right, so you see a lady here, okay, and so you see this physical thing, right? But what you're able to abstract is the idea or the concept or the of lady, right? That's the form or human being, or more specifically a woman, right? And so he's saying that without that physical contact to the senses, our intellect in this life can't come to know things. It has to use the body. Sense, imagination, and the other powers belonging to the sensitive part make use of a corporeal organ. Wherefore, it is clear that for the intellect to understand actually, not only when it acquires fresh knowledge, but also when it applies knowledge already acquired, there is need for the act of the imagination and of the other powers. And let me just read this part real quickly because I think this is interesting. Secondly, he says anyone can experience this of himself, that when he tries to understand something, he forms certain phantasms to serve him by way of examples. So if you're thinking about that conversation you had with a coworker yesterday, you're picturing it in your mind. You picture the coworker, you picture where you are, right? So all these phantasms are coming back, and that's helping you to remember memory and all that, right? So, all right, I think that's enough for that one. And let's see, I think I'm going to have to, this goes back to 7, and he's talking about no, I just don't think I have time for this. Okay, I think we've explained this. He says, for the intellect to understand actually its proper object, it must of necessity turn to the phantasms in order to perceive the universal natures existing in the individual. Universals, particulars, nominalism, realism, it's so very important. Okay, number 8, whether the judgment of the intellect is hindered through suspension of the sensitive powers. What he's going to say here is, it's the same thing. We need the senses, we need the phantasms, the imagination. We need to be able to draw the species out of things that we see, like this woman with the ice cream. If she didn't have the use of her faculty and her senses, and if those were suspended, well, then the mind, it's not going to work, right? In the present state of life, whatever we understand, we know by comparison to natural, sensible things. It is not possible for intellect to form a perfect judgment while the senses are suspended, through which sensible things are known to us. Okay, I know this has been a long haul. Again, it's so very important that we understand the relationship between the body, the senses, the intellect, the active, the passive intellect, and the reason and the will, and all these kind of things. So it all works together so nicely, like a symphony. But I will wrap this up. Thank you for watching. Thank you for journeying through the Summa with me, one question at a time. And be sure to list your comments or questions or whatever below. And God bless you. Thanks for watching.